The interior corridor door to the west nursery wing was locked from the inside. It was never locked from the inside. The royal guard assigned to evening rotation paused, noticing the thin line of light beneath the frame and the absence of the required access entry in the digital log. He rested his hand near his radio, but did not call it in. Something about the silence beyond that door felt deliberate. The corridor outside the west nursery wing carried a stillness that felt deliberate rather than accidental, the kind of silence that settled only after routine had completed itself. The royal guard stood before the reinforced oak door, its brass plate polished to a muted sheen under the wall sconces. The lighting was low for evening protocol, reduced to a warm half-glow to discourage unnecessary movement. He checked the access tablet mounted discreetly beside the frame. The screen displayed the final authorized entry at 2042, Governess Eleanor Morch, biometric confirmation logged, door sealed at 2105. No further activity, no overrides, no internal requests. The lock indicator, however, showed a manual deadbolt engaged from inside at 2211. That detail did not align with the system record. The nursery wing was designed to seal externally after curfew, but interior bolts were rarely used except during controlled medical visits or high-security alerts. There had been no alert. He pressed his thumb to the verification pad and reviewed the log again, slower this time. Nothing. The air in the corridor felt cooler than the rest of the palace, a byproduct of independent climate control installed for the child's comfort. It carried a faint scent of lavender from the diffuser placed near the entry, subtle and regulated. He listened. No footsteps, no movement. Only the low hum of conditioned air behind the walls. Protocol required immediate containment and notification of Central Command. The procedure was explicit. If an access discrepancy appeared in a restricted minors wing, the guard was to seal the perimeter and await supervisory clearance before engaging further. He keyed his radio but did not transmit. Instead, he placed his ear lightly against the wood. The door was thick, soundproofed to preserve the child's rest. Still, trained instinct often registered shifts before sound did. He sensed weight on the other side, not motion, presence. At 2219, footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor, measured and purposeful. He turned. Prince William emerged from the cross passage, jacket unbuttoned, expression composed but firm. The prince's presence at this hour was not unusual. Fathers sometimes made unrecorded visits. What was unusual was the absence of advance notice. The prince stopped a few paces short of the door. "I requested privacy in the west wing tonight," he said evenly. No raised voice, no irritation. The statement was framed as clarification, not confrontation. The guard inclined his head respectfully, but did not move from his position. "Your Royal Highness, there is no logged authorization for restricted isolation." The prince's gaze flicked briefly to the access panel. It was verbal. The guard understood the weight of that answer. Within palace culture, verbal instructions from senior royals often carried immediate compliance. Yet child protection protocols had been revised after prior security audits. Any privacy directive concerning the nursery required written confirmation attached to the internal system. The absence of that clearance created a procedural void. The guard felt the quiet pressure of rank pressing against regulation. He remained still, posture neutral. The prince stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "I do not wish this escalated." The corridor seemed narrower now, the sconces casting longer shadows against the paneled walls. The guard's training did not prepare him for defiance, but it prepared him for hesitation. He looked once more at the door, at the inactive log, at the deadbolt status glowing amber. Inside that wing was a sleeping child. The system showed no authorized adult within. The prince waited for compliance. The guard did not yet move. The silence between them extended, controlled but dense. The royal guard felt the expectation settle in the space like pressure before a storm. Prince William did not repeat himself. He simply stood, composed, confident in the natural order of command. The guard's responsibility, however, did not begin and end with deference. It began with protection, especially when the protected was unable to speak for himself. "Your Royal Highness," the guard said carefully, tone steady, "security control requires documented confirmation before releasing a sealed nursery wing." The words were chosen with precision, not refusal, not accusation, procedure. The prince's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You are suggesting my instruction is insufficient." "You are suggesting," the guard replied, "that the system reflects no authorized presence inside." He watched the prince absorb that. There was no visible anger, only a cooling of expression. The prince stepped to the access panel and examined the display himself. The amber deadbolt indicator glowed steadily. "I have not entered," the prince said after a moment. It was a quiet admission, one that shifted the corridor's temperature more than any draft. If the prince had not entered and the governess had signed out, then someone else had engaged the interior bolt. The guard keyed his radio once more. He hesitated only a fraction of a second before transmitting a coded status inquiry to Central Command. Low priority, informational, not yet an alert. Static answered, then acknowledgement. While waiting for response, he tested the handle gently. It did not move. The interior bolt was firmly set. The prince's gaze returned to him, no longer paternal but analytical. "Who else has access?" he asked. The guard recited the list from memory. The assigned governess, 2 pediatric medical officers, the head of household security, and in exceptional circumstances, senior royal guardians, each requiring biometric confirmation. No manual deadbolt could be engaged without someone physically inside. Central Command replied through the earpiece. No remote override issued, no maintenance logged, no emergency trigger detected. The guard felt the situation tighten. He pictured the nursery layout beyond the door, the small bed positioned away from windows, the soft night lamp shaped like a crescent moon, the interior camera mounted above the bookshelf. If someone had entered through an alternative access point, it would have required deliberate knowledge of the wing's structure. The prince moved closer to the door now, concern replacing irritation. "Open it," he said, quieter than before. The command was no longer about authority. It carried uncertainty. The guard weighed the sequence. Protocol demanded supervisor clearance before breach. Instinct demanded immediacy. He could request full authorization, which would take several minutes, or he could engage emergency discretion, triggering a silent internal review that would automatically log his override. Either choice would be recorded. Either choice would be judged later. He pressed his palm against the cool wood of the door. It felt solid, indifferent. Inside, no sound emerged, not a cry, not movement, only the mechanical quiet of sealed space. He made his decision. His thumb moved to the concealed emergency release panel beneath the access screen. The system prompted confirmation. He glanced once at the prince, who gave a single restrained nod. He initiated the override. Inside the wing, a faint metallic shift answered, something adjusting beyond the door. He froze.
That sound had not been part of the unlocking sequence.
The metallic shift from within the wing did not repeat itself. It ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the corridor suspended in a silence that felt measured rather than empty. The override sequence remained active beneath the guard's thumb, awaiting final confirmation. Prince William's expression had changed. The earlier firmness had given way to alert concentration. "That was not the lock," the prince said quietly. The guard did not answer. He was replaying the internal mechanics of the door in his mind, the layered bolts, the magnetic seal, the pressure release. None of them produced a loose metallic echo. This sound had been lighter, displaced. He withdrew his thumb from the final release. "I need central confirmation," he said, tone even. The prince's gaze sharpened. "We do not have time for layered bureaucracy." The guard understood the implication. Hesitation could create risk, yet opening prematurely without controlled support could create greater vulnerability. He raised his radio slightly and issued a coded escalation to Palace Security Control. Level 2 silent support, West Nursery Corridor. Not a general alarm, not yet. The reply came within seconds. Mobile unit en route, estimated arrival 90 seconds. The prince exhaled slowly through his nose, an effort to contain impatience. "You are prioritizing procedure over proximity," he observed. "I am prioritizing containment," the guard replied. The distinction was deliberate. The lighting in the corridor hummed faintly overhead. Somewhere deeper in the palace, a clock struck the quarter hour, its tone softened by distance. The guard adjusted his stance so that his body partially shielded the prince from direct line with the door. It was instinctive positioning, not symbolic. The prince noticed but did not comment. "I gave instruction earlier this evening," the prince said after a pause. "I asked that the West Wing not be disturbed." "There is no record attached to the request," the guard responded. "It was conveyed through private staff." That detail registered sharply. Private staff were not authorized to transmit nursery isolation directives without security logging. "Which staff member?" the guard asked. The prince hesitated, as if retracing the conversation. "My equerry passed the message to facilities." Facilities. The word settled uneasily. Facilities personnel did not possess standing clearance to alter nursery security conditions. They could maintain systems, but only under documented escort. The guard felt the procedural lines crossing in ways they were never designed to. Footsteps approached from behind, 2 additional guards from internal security, silent and composed. They positioned themselves at measured intervals along the corridor, forming a controlled perimeter without visible alarm. The prince observed the reinforcement, and a flicker of realization passed across his face. This was no longer a private disagreement. It was an operational matter. The guard turned back to the access panel and reviewed the system diagnostics in greater depth. The interior camera feed showed static at 22:12, precisely 1 minute after the deadbolt registered. The static had lasted 11 seconds. Then the feed resumed. Empty room, lights dimmed, crib visible, no movement. That interruption had not triggered an alert because the system classified it as signal fluctuation. The guard felt the quiet tightening of his jaw. Signal fluctuation did not engage interior bolts. "Your Royal Highness," he said calmly, "did your equerry specify maintenance within the nursery?" The prince's answer came measured. He would not have had cause. The guard nodded once. 90 seconds had passed. Central Command signaled readiness for coordinated entry. The door remained closed, the amber indicator steady. The prince looked at the guard again, this time without resistance. "Proceed." The Royal Guard initiated the coordinated breach protocol, his movements deliberate and economical. One internal security officer stepped forward to flank the opposite side of the frame, while the other covered the corridor behind them.
The prince remained just beyond the threshold line, close enough to see, but far enough to avoid obstructing formation. The guard entered his biometric code, then engaged the emergency override fully. The magnetic seal disengaged with a low, controlled hum. The primary lock released. The interior deadbolt, however, resisted for half a second longer before retracting with a sharper click. That delay confirmed it had been manually set. The door opened inward slowly, revealing the dim amber wash of the nursery interior. The air inside was warmer, carrying the soft scent of baby powder and linen. Nothing appeared immediately disturbed. The crib stood centered against the far wall, white rails intact. The child lay on his side beneath a light blanket, breathing evenly. The small crescent-shaped night lamp glowed near the bookshelf. The guard stepped inside first, scanning left to right with disciplined precision. No visible intruder, no overturned furniture, no open windows. Yet something in the atmosphere felt altered. The stillness was too complete. He moved toward the wall console where the interior camera feed was mounted. The indicator light was dark. He leaned closer. The power cable had been loosened, not cut, not severed, but deliberately detached from its seating. A minimal action, intentional. He felt the prince enter behind him, stopping short of the crib. The prince's focus went immediately to the child, whose breathing remained calm and rhythmic. Relief softened his shoulders, but it did not erase the tension in the room. "He is unharmed," the prince said quietly. "Yes, sir," the guard replied, though his attention remained on the room's perimeter. He examined the secondary service door positioned near the wardrobe alcove, a narrow panel rarely used except during renovation cycles. Its internal latch hung slightly misaligned. He crouched and inspected the hinge. Fine metallic residue dusted the lower edge, fresh and faintly reflective under the lamp. It matched the sound they had heard. Someone had tested or partially forced the secondary access from within, not successfully, but deliberately. The guard rose slowly. The prince watched him now, not as subordinate, but as professional. "This was not maintenance," the guard said, voice low. "It was not accusation, it was assessment." He activated a silent, full lockdown command through his wrist unit. Across the palace interior, unobtrusive barriers would begin sealing secondary corridors without triggering public alarm. The nursery wing was now under contained investigation. The child stirred faintly in his sleep, but did not wake. The guard stepped back toward the main door, positioning himself between the room and the corridor. He knew what this meant. Someone had relied on the assumption that a prince's verbal instruction would discourage scrutiny. Someone had anticipated compliance. Instead, they had encountered pause. The prince looked once more at the unsecured camera cable, then at the misaligned service panel. "Whoever did this," he said quietly, "expected privacy." The guard nodded. Privacy had nearly become vulnerability. Outside, additional security personnel moved into position, their footsteps muted by carpeted floors. The investigation had begun, and it would not remain contained to this corridor long. The nursery wing was sealed within 3 minutes of the breach. The corridor outside shifted from quiet tension to controlled containment. Additional security officers arrived in measured succession, each briefed in low tones, each instructed to avoid visible escalation. The royal guard remained inside the nursery for the first sweep, methodically documenting the irregularities before external investigators entered. The child continued sleeping, undisturbed by the quiet movement around him. The crescent lamp cast a soft amber arc across the crib rails, leaving the far corners of the ceiling in shadow. The detached camera cable hung loosely against the wall, its port clean, not torn. It had been eased free. The guard crouched again at the secondary service door. The hinge plate bore slight scoring along its edge, thin, shallow lines consistent with a narrow prying instrument, not forceful enough to splinter wood, careful enough to test resistance without triggering acoustic sensors. He pressed gently against the panel. It shifted inward by less than a centimeter before meeting the internal catch. Someone had attempted entry from the adjoining maintenance corridor but had not completed it, or had been interrupted. He stood and mentally reconstructed the sequence. At 22:11, the interior deadbolt engaged. At 22:12, the camera feed flickered. 11 seconds of static. During that window, the cable was disengaged. After that, the room appeared normal on resumed feed. Crib, lamp, empty floor. Whoever was inside understood timing and placement. The prince remained near the crib, hands resting lightly against the rail, eyes steady on his son. He did not speak. The earlier friction in the corridor had dissolved into something quieter, recognition. The guard approached him with restrained composure. "Your Royal Highness, we will need to relocate him temporarily." The prince nodded once. "Proceed." The guard signaled for a female security officer trained in child transfer protocol. She entered with sanitized gloves, lifting the child carefully without waking him. The boy shifted slightly, then settled against her shoulder. The prince stepped back to allow space, his jaw set, but expression contained. No panic, only focus. The guard escorted them through the inner corridor to a secondary secured suite already cleared and monitored. Once the child was placed safely, the guard returned to the nursery wing. Forensic specialists had begun a silent sweep. Ultraviolet scanners traced the floorboards. A portable access console was connected to the camera unit to retrieve cached data from the 11-second interruption. The guard watched without interfering. He was not investigator by title, but he was witness by proximity. "Preliminary impression?" the head of palace security asked quietly as he joined him. The guard kept his voice low. "Intentional disengagement, attempted service access, no evidence of direct approach to the crib." The head of security absorbed that. And the prince? He did not enter the wing prior to our arrival. That fact now carried weight. If the prince had not been inside, then the verbal privacy instruction had created opportunity without physical presence. The guard felt the implication forming. Authority, invoked but not exercised, had been used as insulation. A forensic officer approached with a small sealed pouch. Inside lay a slender metal tension tool recovered from the maintenance corridor side of the service panel. It had been dropped or left behind. The guard studied it through the plastic. It was not standard palace equipment. It was specialized, someone familiar with secure latching systems. The head of security exhaled slowly. "Internal knowledge," he said, "not accusation, assessment." The guard's thoughts returned briefly to the equerry's conveyed message and the facilities channel through which it had passed, layers of assumption. No direct order recorded, no escort assigned, just enough ambiguity to soften scrutiny. He felt a controlled tightening in his chest, not fear, but clarity. The vulnerability had not been physical strength, it had been procedural hesitation. The retrieval of cached camera data required delicate extraction. The 11-second interruption had not erased completely. Fragments remained in buffer storage. A technician projected the recovered frames onto a secure tablet. The image stuttered, distorted by static interference, then stabilized for less than a second at a time. The guard leaned closer. In one fractured frame, near the wardrobe alcove, a shadow cut across the lower edge of the wall, brief, indistinct, but present. Not large enough to be furniture movement, not consistent with camera glitch, human proportion. The next fragment showed nothing but distortion. Then normal feed resumed. Crib centered, empty floor. "Timestamp aligns with deadbolt engagement," the technician said. The guard nodded once. Whoever entered had moved quickly, deliberately, and avoided lingering within camera range after disabling it. The interior bolt had been set from inside to create delay from the outside. That meant physical presence within the room at 2211. "Entry point?" the head of security asked. "Maintenance corridor," the guard answered. "The service panel shows attempted inward breach, but entry likely achieved before the panel resisted." The maintenance corridor ran behind the west wing, accessible only through a coded staff junction. Facilities personnel held rotating access, but only under logged assignment. The head of security issued a directive for immediate audit of maintenance corridor access logs for the past 72 hours. The prince re-entered the nursery wing briefly, escorted by another officer. He observed the forensic sweep without speaking, eyes settling on the recovered tension tool displayed on the tray. "You were correct to escalate," he said quietly to the guard. It was not praise, it was acknowledgement. The guard inclined his head slightly. "The system required clarity, sir." The prince studied the misaligned service panel. "My instruction was meant to create calm, not vulnerability." The guard did not respond to that. It was not his place to interpret intention. His responsibility had been action. Outside the wing, the lockdown extended discreetly through adjoining corridors. Staff were redirected without explanation. No alarms sounded publicly. Within the palace, events often unfolded behind layers of composure. A senior investigator approached with preliminary log findings. At 2148, a facilities supervisor accessed the maintenance corridor junction under routine diagnostic clearance. No escort recorded. The guard's attention sharpened. Name? The investigator provided it. A contracted maintenance supervisor, recently assigned to infrastructure review. Authorized for systems assessment, but not for nursery adjacency without security presence. The guard replayed the timeline again in his mind. Verbal privacy instruction conveyed verbally. Facilities notified informally. Supervisor gains access to the corridor under routine diagnostic cover. 11 minutes later, interior bolt engaged. Camera disabled. Service panel tested. The sequence was methodical, not impulsive. "Intent?" the prince asked, voice steady. The investigator did not speculate. Unknown. The guard understood what that meant. Without direct contact with the child, the act might be classified as probing rather than attempt. But probing within a royal nursery was not benign. It was rehearsal. He felt the weight of what nearly occurred, not dramatized, not exaggerated, simply recognized. The decision to pause at an unrecorded lock had disrupted timing. Had he complied immediately with rank and opened the door without scrutiny, the corridor would have lacked reinforcement. The maintenance supervisor might have withdrawn undetected. The prince looked toward the secured suite down the hall, where his son now slept under increased guard. "Initiate full internal investigation," he said. It was directive, not emotional. The head of security nodded. Orders would move quietly through channels by morning. The guard stepped back into his assigned position at the nursery threshold, posture composed, senses alert. The palace resumed its outward stillness, but beneath it, systems recalibrated. Authority had nearly bypassed safeguard. It would not happen again without record.
By midnight, the west interior corridors had resumed their outward calm, though movement beneath that calm had intensified. The royal guard stood post outside the temporary secured suite where the child now slept. The air here was marginally cooler, filtered through a separate intake system reserved for contingency relocation. Inside the suite, 2 silent monitors tracked motion and respiration. No one entered without dual authorization. The guard's posture remained formal, but his attention tracked the rhythm of the corridor. Footsteps, muted radio pulses, distant elevator hums. Every sound had context now.
At 0017, the head of palace security approached with a sealed update file. "Preliminary access audit," he said quietly. The guard stepped aside slightly to receive the summary. The facilities supervisor, contracted, not permanent, had accessed the maintenance junction in 2148 using legitimate credentials. The assignment description listed ventilation variance inspection. No escort had been scheduled because the task classification did not intersect restricted wings. However, the audit revealed something narrower, a temporary system mapping request filed earlier that afternoon by the same supervisor. The mapping request included layout schematics of the West Nursery corridor ventilation shafts. That detail had not triggered review because the request was framed as airflow calibration. The guard felt the pattern consolidating, not reckless intrusion, structured reconnaissance. "Where is he now?" the guard asked. "Contained," the head of security replied. "Administrative pretext. He believes this is a documentation review." The guard nodded once. Confrontation would come later, through proper channels. For now, containment preserved information. At 0026, Prince William entered the corridor again, this time accompanied by his private secretary. His demeanor had shifted from paternal urgency to measured authority. "The king has been briefed," the prince said, stopping before the guard. The phrasing carried weight. Escalation had moved upward. "There will be formal review," he continued, "not limited to facilities." The guard understood the implication. The privacy instruction, verbal, undocumented, would be examined as well. Authority misuse did not require malice, it required assumption. The prince's eyes held steady contact. "You will provide your account in full." "Yes, sir." No embellishment, no defense, just record. The corridor lighting reflected faintly against the polished floor, creating elongated bands of pale gold. It was nearly 1 in the morning. Within the secured suite, the child turned softly in sleep. The guard heard it through the partially open interior door and registered relief without expression. A message vibrated discreetly against his wrist unit. "Central Command Directive. Internal lockdown tier maintained until 0600. External staff movements minimized. All maintenance access suspended pending review." The palace would wake to routine breakfast briefings, unaware how narrowly vulnerability had approached. The prince exhaled quietly. "I instructed privacy," he said, almost to himself. "I did not authorize isolation of oversight." The guard did not respond. He remained within his lane, observation, containment, protection. Footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor. A senior advisor to the king joined them, expression composed, voice low. "His Majesty has ordered a full security audit of minor protection protocols," he said, "effective immediately." The directive settled like a formal seal. The guard felt not triumph, not validation, but responsibility. The system had held, barely. It would now be strengthened. At 2:10, the facilities supervisor was escorted to a secure administrative chamber within the palace complex. The royal guard was not present for the formal questioning, but he observed through controlled relay feed accessible to senior security staff. The room was neutral, plain table, 2 chairs, recording device visible. The supervisor appeared composed, perhaps confused, hands folded in front of him. He confirmed requesting ventilation schematics. He confirmed accessing the maintenance junction. He denied entering the nursery wing. When asked about the tension tool recovered from the service corridor, his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "Standard diagnostic instrument," he said. The head of security placed a still image from the recovered camera fragment on the table. The shadow near the wardrobe alcove. "Explain this." Silence followed, not dramatic, but dense. The supervisor did not confess. He did not argue. He simply measured his answers more carefully thereafter. The guard studied the man's expression. It was not impulsive aggression he saw. It was calculation, the kind that tested limits before exceeding them. At 3 o'clock, the prince returned briefly to the secured suite to observe his son. The guard remained outside, gaze forward. After a moment, the prince stepped back into the corridor. "He slept through it," he said quietly. The guard inclined his head. "Yes, sir." "He will not be told," the prince added. It was not denial, it was protection. The guard understood that, too. The advisor to the king rejoined them with written directive in hand. "Effective this morning, no verbal instruction, regardless of rank, shall alter nursery security conditions without logged confirmation through central command." The prince accepted the document without objection. Understood. The guard observed the exchange carefully. There was no resistance now, only recalibration. Authority had been exercised in good faith, but without documentation. That gap had created opportunity for exploitation. Dawn approached slowly beyond the palace windows, pale gray light replacing the amber glow of corridor lamps. By 5:45, lockdown tier was downgraded from containment to controlled monitoring. The maintenance supervisor remained under restricted status pending full investigation. The Royal Guard's shift technically ended at 600, yet he did not request relief until the replacement officer arrived and received comprehensive briefing. He described the deadbolt indicator, the camera interruption, the metallic sound, the prince's arrival, the escalation, no detail omitted, no embellishment added. When finally stepping away from the secured suite, he paused once at the west nursery corridor. The original door stood closed again, systems recalibrated, logs active and monitored. It appeared ordinary, solid oak, polished brass. The irregularity lasted less than an hour. Its consequences would last much longer. As morning staff began quiet preparations for the day, the palace projected its customary composure. Behind that composure, directives moved through channels, audits initiated, hierarchies reminded of limits. The guard walked the length of the corridor one final time before descending to debrief. He did not consider himself central to the outcome. He had observed, hesitated, escalated. That was the function. Yet he understood something had shifted. Protection within these walls did not depend solely on loyalty or rank. It depended on pause, on the refusal to allow familiarity to override safeguard. The child slept on, unaware of proximity. The system, corrected, resumed its silent watch.
The internal review began at 9 in a secured conference chamber overlooking the eastern gardens. Morning light filtered through tall windows, softened by sheer drapery, casting a restrained glow across the long oak table. The Royal Guard stood at the far end of the room, not seated among advisors or administrators, but present as primary witness. His uniform remained immaculate, posture steady, expression neutral. Around the table sat the head of palace security, 2 senior legal advisors, the King's private secretary, and Prince William. A digital screen displayed a precise timeline, beginning at 21:48. No one spoke until the clock reached the hour exactly. The King entered without ceremony. Conversation ceased. He acknowledged the room with a brief nod and took his seat. "We will proceed factually," he said. The tone was calm, neither accusatory nor indulgent. The timeline advanced. Maintenance junction access, ventilation schematic request, verbal privacy instruction, interior deadbolt engagement, camera interruption, recovery of unauthorized tool. Each event appeared in sequence, stripped of emotion. When prompted, the guard recounted his observations in measured detail.
He described the amber indicator, the absence of authorization, the prince's arrival, the decision to escalate before opening the door. He did not frame the moment as conflict. He framed it as discrepancy. The king listened without interruption, hands folded loosely before him. "You were instructed to avoid escalation," the king said after a pause, addressing the guard directly. "Yes, Your Majesty." "And yet you escalated." "Yes, Your Majesty." No justification followed. The room absorbed the simplicity of that exchange. The king's gaze shifted briefly toward his son, then back to the guard. "On what basis?" The guard met the question evenly. "On the absence of record, sir." Silence settled again, but it carried weight of consideration rather than tension. Prince William spoke next, voice composed. "The instruction originated with me. It was conveyed verbally and without documentation. That gap enabled misinterpretation. The admission was precise, not defensive." The king inclined his head slightly. "Authority does not suspend safeguard," he said quietly. The statement did not single out blame, it defined principle. The facilities supervisor's preliminary findings were summarized next. Under further questioning at dawn, he had acknowledged testing the service panel to assess response time vulnerabilities. He maintained he had no intention of direct contact with the child. The explanation was clinical, detached from emotional consequence. "Intent does not mitigate breach," the head of security observed. The king agreed. The guard remained still, absorbing each detail as it aligned with his own reconstruction. What had felt instinctive at 2219 now appeared procedural in hindsight. The pause at the door had not been defiance, it had been discipline. The king turned once more to the guard. "If you were placed in identical circumstance again," he asked, "would you act differently?" The question held no trap, only evaluation. "No, Your Majesty." The answer was steady. The king held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. "Good." By midday, formal directives were drafted and circulated through internal channels. Verbal instructions affecting restricted wings were prohibited without simultaneous system entry. Maintenance corridor access near minor residences required dual escort. Interior camera systems would trigger immediate alert upon manual disengagement, regardless of duration. Each amendment stemmed from a narrow gap revealed the previous night. The Royal Guard returns to his assigned rotation in the West Corridor, now restored to ordinary rhythm. The nursery door looked unchanged, though its protocols had tightened invisibly. The child played inside under the supervision of the governess, unaware of administrative reform unfolding beyond the walls. Laughter drifted faintly through the door once in the afternoon, light, uncomplicated. The guard registered it without visible reaction, yet it reinforced purpose more effectively than any commendation. Later that day, Prince William approached alone, no aides, no security cluster. He stopped at the guard's post, hands clasped behind his back. "You placed my son above my instruction," he said quietly. The statement was not reproach. The guard maintained formal stance. "I placed documented safeguard above assumption, sir." The prince considered that for a moment, then gave a restrained nod. "That is precisely why you stand here." No further praise followed. None was needed. The exchange ended there. In the administrative wing, the facilities supervisor's contract was terminated pending external inquiry. His access credentials were permanently revoked. The official statement would describe procedural noncompliance. It would not mention proximity to a child's room. The palace preferred discretion over spectacle. As evening approached again, the West Corridor settled into its customary hush. Lighting dimmed gradually, scent diffusers engaged, external gates locked in sequence. The guard took position at 21:30, the same hour he had stood there the night before. He glanced once at the access panel, all indicators steady, all logs synchronized. The memory of the amber deadbolt light remained clear in his mind, not as anxiety, but as reminder. Protection within these walls did not rely solely on rank, loyalty, or tradition. It relied on interruption, the willingness to pause when something minor felt misplaced. At 2200, the nursery wing sealed according to schedule. At 2211, no irregularity appeared. No metallic shift echoed behind the door, only controlled silence. The guard rested his gloved hand briefly near the panel, feeling the faint vibration of active systems beneath the wood. He did not anticipate recognition. He did not expect gratitude beyond what had already been given. His function was narrower and steadier than that. Within the palace, authority carried weight, but vigilance carried responsibility. And when the two conflicted, it was vigilance that preserved the child sleeping safely beyond the door.